All right, thanks, John. So it's a pleasure presenting at this session. I thought when I was invited to speak, I thought it might be fun just to give kind of a high-level overview. And so later, the organizers decided to kind of make this a feature talk. But I just emphasize that, researchers kind of within this field, I mean, they all kind of bring unique perspectives and combinations of experience. And so I don't feel kind of, especially qualified to kind of give this perspective overview. I can, certainly share things, from my own kind of background and the way I see things. But, any of the other presenters in this workshop would also do a fantastic job, I think, of giving an overview of the field. So in any case, I'll basically start by acknowledging that a lot of the ideas that I'm going to share are actually based on things that I've actually learned from my colleagues, in particular Mike Tolley and Elliot Hawks. And so together we recently worked on a review article for Science Robotics, hard questions for soft robotics. And a lot of the ideas that actually come from them, I was kind of more or less along for the ride here, but I'll do my best to kind of convey some of the ideas that they had. One thing that really stood out to us as we prepared that perspective article was that there has been this really dramatic growth and interest and activity in the field of soft robotics. And I think that's obvious to pretty much everybody working in the field. And then really, as we see this growth, I mean, there's of course all sorts of opportunities that come along with that, but there also are concerns. We will soon, if not already, hit an inflection point where we'll see these publications start to hit a kind of a steady state, and then the question is going to be, what's success going to mean for this field of soft robotics? And when we think about leveraging all the amazing work that's been done in material science and in chemistry, and then also kind of more mainstream conventional fields within robotics, does it still make sense to kind of merge these different fields together to pursue some of these common challenges, or are we going to see kind of a case where we might start broadening and really kind of expanding the field out and maybe kind of dividing out into different disciplines and new domains? And so there's still a lot of questions for what that's going to look like in the upcoming decade. First, though, I just wanted to kind of reflect on kind of the past and a little bit of the history of soft robotics. And so I think this is something a lot of you are already familiar with, and there's different ways of framing this. But in my mind, I mean, a lot of the interest in kind of using soft materials within a robotics context really kind of originated with research on pneumatic artificial muscles, and that was kind of most famously done by Joe McKibben with the McKibben actuator and his work on hand exoskeletons. But there's been tremendous other research in other types of material architectures for pneumatic artificial muscles. There's a really good review article here at the bottom that covers a lot of the progress over the decades since those early days. This is actually, we kind of call it the McKibben actuator, but that architecture actually had been introduced by other researchers in Europe and North America. Parallel with this, there has been a kind of a steady progress in the development of soft and stretchable electronics and sensors. So I find it very interesting that kind of in the late 1940s, just as we were seeing these pneumatic artificial muscles introduced, we also saw the introduction of what we now call the Whitney strain gauge, or the use of liquid metals inside rubber to create these highly elastic strain gauges and electronics. And so in a sense, these two fields of soft robotics and soft electronics have over the decades been growing in parallel. I would say the 80s is kind of when we saw this kind of transition to a new era in soft robotics. And so still a lot of continued interest in these pneumatic artificial muscles, a lot of really beautiful modeling work and really kind of extensive studies in terms of characterizing the properties by folks like Blake Hannaford and others. And then also kind of, expanding the range of applications of robotics where these pneumatic artificial muscles can be used. And a lot of that activity started out in Japan. But I think during this time, from the 1980s to the early 2000s, we also saw this kind of, in a sense, almost paradigm shift, or this transition away from the kind of the McKibben style pneumatic architectures to a kind of much broader range of different types of soft, flexible actuators. So Koichi Suzumori, who kind of gave that excellent talk here to kind of kick off the workshop, has really been a pioneer in looking at not just kind of changing these material architectures, but also looking at various length scales, and has done some really great work since the 90s and then miniaturizing these soft actuators. And of course, there's work by Ian Walker and Chris Rahn and others around this time looking at these continuum robots like the Octarm and looking at some real world applications of that. So that kind of is kind of represent the foundations in my mind of soft robotics. But what I really want to emphasize here is that none of these publications, none of these studies up until this point in kind of the early mid 2000s ever mention the word soft robotics. You look at Professor Suzumori's work, and he talks about flexible micro actuators. If you're just doing a raw a Google Scholar search on soft robotics, virtually none of these papers, none of these studies are going to show up, right? So just be conscious of that, and be very careful for those of you who are kind of new to the field, who want to kind of learn more about some of the history here. The term soft robotics really emerged kind of a little bit more recently, and I say this kind of represents this almost third era in soft robotics, where we see kind of a lot of institutional funding, starting with DARPA ChemBots and the EU on the Robosoft and their kind of commission on soft robotics, and then more recently the TRICO robot initiative from the National Science Foundation in China. And from that, we've kind of seen this is kind of what initiated, I think, this kind of explosion of kind of interest and activity in soft robotics, and really kind of broadening the scope now beyond just pneumatic artificial muscles to shape memory alloys, dielectrical elastomer, actuators, magnetics, and all the other types of things that you've been learning about in this workshop. So going back to this plot of publications per year, we kind of see that early on we have these or at least kind of in this current kind of era of soft robotics, we see it initiated by these institutional initiatives like DARPA ChemBots, but then we see this kind of really dramatic growth, and kind of along with that we have forums dedicated to soft robotics and exchange of ideas. So we have the Journal of Soft Robotics and also the Robosoft conferences that started in 2018. Now, what I'll kind of emphasize here is that although these conferences and dedicated journals have been really great for the field, they alone don't explain this really dramatic increase in research output. I mean, the Robosoft, I think, is about 90 publications per year, and that doesn't really explain this hundreds and hundreds of new publications coming out each year, and so I think there's kind of a lot of various factors, I think, that go into explaining why we're seeing this growth. And I mean, you kind of survey, all the researchers in the field, all the different presenters in this workshop, and I think they'll all come up with really good ideas for other factors that contribute as well. But I think that the big question, and hopefully there's time at the end here for a little bit of a conversation about what is success going to look like for the field of soft robotics moving forward. So I'll kind of hopefully do my best to kind of give some answers, or at least give my perspective on that. I do want to mention, just kind of in parallel, I mean, as we've seen kind of the growth of soft robotics, we've also seen, the pretty, dramatic growth in other fields and topics as well, but not quite at the scale of what we're seeing with soft robotics. So my PhD work and kind of what got me started in academic research was gecko-inspired adhesives. And when I was first starting out as a PhD, that was also kind of on this upswing. Now, we're not talking thousands of, over 1,000 papers a year, but, something, approaching, 100 papers a year. But at some point, we saw that level off. Likewise with, bio-inspired engineering, biomimetics, bio-inspired robotics. I mean, that's also another field that kind of in parallel with soft robotics also has been growing, but not quite at the same scale. But I would still say that both of these are fields that have become successful. I would say in the case of bio-inspired robotics, its success has basically been the transition to soft robotics. I feel like in a sense, a lot of the researchers doing bio-inspired robotics, they've been able to kind of transition it or maybe even rebrand their work as soft robotics. And so I think having that earlier field kind of mature into this kind of much bigger field represents kind of one path to success. In the case of get cohesion, which is a little bit more kind of specific and targeted, and it's not as kind of broad and all-encompassing of a topic, in my mind, success is not just this kind of steady state of research output, in recent years, but also the success of commercial startups, companies that have been able to commercialize this research and really get it out into products. And so that's another path of success that I see that soft robotics as a field could potentially follow. Okay, so talking about journal publications and output, that's kind of just one metric for success and well-being of the field. And even something like this, I mean, there certainly are flaws and really just kind of looking at or just fixating on citations or publications or impact factor of journals when it comes to output from the field. I think to kind of get a better perspective on that, something that Elliot and Mike and I looked at was actually a scale for kind of not rating publications, but for kind of categorizing publications presented by or introduced by Steve Cranford. So Steve is a former professor and now editor-in-chief of the journal Matter, and he introduced this material advancement progression scale. And for me at least, this has been really helpful, within a materials engineering and material science context, so to really understand the different types of contributions that you can make to the field, and the point here is that no one form or category is necessarily better than the other. So Steve is not assigning value to any one of these categories, but what he is saying is that there is a spectrum in terms of how you can kind of contribute to the advancement. And in the case of soft matter or materials engineering, it ranges everything from kind of more fundamental scientific discovery to kind of just strengthening our understanding of kind of known phenomena or practices within the field, all the way to this kind of more applications focused of taking those kind of materials and then demonstrating them in engineered systems and tackling some of these important real world challenges and in some cases grand challenges within engineering, robotics, and medicine. And so by kind of looking at it, of course, a lot of papers and contributions, they kind of combine a few of these. There's a little bit of new material architecture discovery along with some practical implementations and examples, but to the best of their ability, they just kind of assign one category that represents the real innovative breakthrough of that work, and they kind of see a breakdown like this, and they do generally see this kind of that the papers do kind of span this range. And so that kind of is what inspired us for the science robotics paper to kind of think about what would be levels of contribution for the field of soft robotics. Now I will say that when we did put this together, I mean, we were kind of to some extent assigning value to these categories. So in this sense, we are deviating a bit from the spirit and purpose of that map system I just showed you. But I still think it could be useful. Of course, take everything here with a grain of salt. This was put together in a very ad hoc process. We didn't do some systematic survey of all the researchers in the field and come up with a consensus of what we thought made sense. But I mean, just from our kind of own biases and perspectives and thoughts, we kind of came up with these three levels. So level 0 is basically just harkening back to the title of this presentation, soft for soft's sake. And personally, I think there's a lot of value in kind of this dogmatic approach to trying to engineer systems, whether it's sensors or kind of circuits or actuators, robotic systems, entirely out of soft materials. Even if those soft systems don't necessarily solve any important pressing real world challenge, even if they don't outperform other types of more conventionally engineered systems, I personally still think that there is still value in just kind of playing within this space and just seeing what can be done with soft materials. But the feeling is, and I think kind of the growing consensus is that these types of soft for soft's sake implementations and contributions are going to have kind of basically increasingly limited value to the field. Instead, I think that a lot of the effort should now focus on filling in some of the gaps within soft robotics. And so, examples are just, maybe improving energy efficiency, achieving closed loop control, coming up with more accurate methods of computational modeling, untethered functionality. So, things that we hadn't always seen in kind of the earlier soft robotic implementations, these gaps can now be filled, through continued research. However, even if you fill those gaps, you still might end up with a system that underperforms compared to conventional robotic systems and might not really kind of advance, practices in engineering and robotics as a whole. And so that kind of what led us to think about this kind of highest level of contribution, which is really kind of starting with tackling grand challenges in robotics, engineering, medicine, in using kind of practices and material architectures from soft robotics. And the hope here is that the work that that we do and the advancements that we make actually transcend kind of our own community and lead to new capabilities that can kind of impact other domains. They can lead to new insights that can improve practices and understanding in other fields, and ultimately answer the question of why would you make it soft in the first place, right? It'll hopefully with these higher level contributions, that question is self-evident. Okay, so that's related to publication. I mentioned in the field of gecko-inspired adhesion, and success for that field has been translation into commercial products. And we're seeing that already with soft robotics. So there's been a couple of market studies now that look at soft robotics as an industry. Okay, so now looking beyond academia to how is this field making impact within the marketplace. And you have to take these studies with a grain of salt. I mean, they do kind of define soft robotics in a way that I don't think would really align very well with, I think, how a lot of academic researchers think about the field. And so they put a very strong emphasis on wearable robotics, exoskeletons, and co-robotics, so the full system itself isn't necessarily made out of soft materials, but they could incorporate some soft sensors, some soft actuators, or elements that allow for compatibility with the human body. Okay, so I've noticed that with these market studies, they take a fairly liberal definition of what they're considering to be soft robotics. Nonetheless, I mean, what we see consistently with all these studies are these pretty impressive projections for growth for the industry. So, for the most part, they kind of say, in terms of, if you just aggregate the valuation of all the companies kind of within the space, the total valuation of the industry is on the order of about $1 billion today. But the expectation is that's going to increase by several fold over the next few years. And so, these 40% year over year projections kind of suggest that you'll see every 2 years you're going to see this kind of doubling in the size of the market. So another kind of I think useful insight from these market studies is to kind of break down soft robotics into these different categories. Again, you see kind of wearable robotics and co-robotics kind of dominate. Again, up to you if you want to what extent you want to kind of consider those as soft robotic systems. But what's really nice to see here is inflatable systems, soft grippers, medical and healthcare type systems, which are I think universally kind of accepted to be kind of soft robotic systems, also do represent a fairly big chunk of the market, and they will also grow over these next few years. With all that said, though, I mean, when you think, kind of step back and you put this in the context of just, robotics more generally, $1 billion sounds like a lot, but it's a drop in the bucket, compared to the overall robotics industry. So just even in Pittsburgh alone, which is a leading center for the robotics industry, I mean, soft robotics still has a somewhat negligible, not I shouldn't say negligible, but represents a very small portion of activity. At least locally, the companies that I talk to, they're not begging us for kind of soft robotics, to solve a lot of their challenges. At most they might, be interested in, some type of actuator or maybe an electrostatic, clutch, or, more often they're interested in the sensors and stretchable electronics that come out of the soft robotics community. But still, there is this kind of big gap and big divide between what the much more established and mature robotics industry kind of want and expect versus what the much smaller soft robotics community is able to deliver, or at least what they're pursuing. And so what that also, and just kind of engaging, with industry more and more, I'm kind of also realizing that for soft robotics to really make impact, in the market and in industry, I don't think we can rely on adoption from these more established companies. I really think that impact is going to be driven through entrepreneurship, through the formation of startup companies or university spinoffs, and really it has to be kind of from the ground up, organic, and really these companies that come from the research groups, I think are going to have to advocate and push for growth in the field. I don't think we can basically continue inventing stuff and expecting that these more mature companies are just going to trip over themselves to go license our technology. In some cases, I'm sure they will, but I think really the best outlook for the field is if we're kind of ourselves kind of aggressive kind of in entrepreneurship and commercial translation. So I have just a few minutes left, and so I'll kind of quickly go over these slides here. There have been some takeaways, at least anecdotally for me, in terms of what it takes to kind of, get these products and technologies out in the marketplace. There's a lot of challenges that go well above and beyond what we've experienced in the research lab to create these. When you talk about technologies that not just work, but kind of work repeatedly under any kind of condition, within an industrial or consumer setting, and that can be mass produced in a way that, everything is kind of robust and reliable from a manufacturing supply chain perspective. There's a lot of hurdles there. And any one of these hurdles could potentially represent a bottleneck. But with all that said, as challenging as it is, I mean, there's been plenty of examples where soft materials have been truly disruptive and have revolutionized different types of industries and practices. I mean, everything from tires, the original kind of early bicycles had metal quote tires or kind of rimmed wheels, and that kind of transitioned to kind of pneumatic tires that just went on to dominate. Same goes with balloon angioplasty that kind of replaced these much more cumbersome kind of rigid dilator technologies. And we're kind of also recently seeing kind of microelectronics, the technologies transition into soft lithography, soft microfluidics for lab on a chip technology. So plenty of examples in the past, and I think that does kind of bode well for the field of soft robotics. Just kind of out of time here, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this. Bottom line is I kind of want to make an argument that another kind of path to success for the field is not necessarily to limit ourselves to robotics, and really kind of think a little bit more broadly about what we're doing in soft robotics is actually being kind of more kind of under the umbrella of soft matter or soft materials engineering. So really taking the practice of condensed or I say the science of condensed soft matter physics, and then putting it into practice. So engineering kind of robotic and computing systems or medical devices, where elastomers, gels, fluids, granular media really have a central role in dictating the functionality of those systems. So I'll just kind of end here. Sorry, I went a bit over time. I don't know if there's going to be time for Q&A, but things to kind of think about are, again, what does success look like for the field of soft robotics? is it important for soft robotics to gain mainstream acceptance by other roboticists, right? Or is it fine for us to kind of branch out, and really kind of, try to kind of, focus on other kind of application domains and not worry about whether or not we're kind of adhering to the dogma and rigor of robotics or not. And that kind of also gets a little bit into the semantics, just as bio-inspired engineering biomedics is kind of morphed into soft robotics. Could soft robotics as a field kind of morph into some of these other domains? I think we're seeing some early signs of that, but that's also something I think to reflect on. All right, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Kamal for this great talk. I knew what would come, but I was definitely again impressed by the research that you did, because I think that is very, very relevant to the whole field, that we have to really think about these points. One quick question from the beginning from me. Do you think we have to stop now somehow doing this playing around with different materials, and if we're lucky we get an actuator out of that is maybe can do something? Is that now the time to somehow move forward from this kind of research to application-driven research?
I think I personally am a huge fan of just kind of the exploration and kind of playing around, and I'm of the attitude, if it's novel, if it's technically accurate and correct, I mean, it should be published and it should be shared with the community. Let others decide if it's if it's valuable. I think the somewhat of the frustration, I think, from colleagues and even from myself sometimes, is when things are called a robot, when they clearly aren't, right? Or they kind of don't really satisfy the definition of what a robot is. And so I think we can at this point be secure enough that this is a really vibrant field, and we don't always have to call it soft robotics or use the term robot to justify what we're doing. And I think people will kind of understand, they'll get it. And yeah, I think we can still play around with materials and try new things and show new things.
Okay, that's great, because I'm a big fan of this. So if there are other, we have another question here from the audience.
Hey, thanks a lot for your presentation. I was actually surprised by some of the conclusions that you had, but I want to ask about an assumption that you seem to have made, and that is that soft robotics actually is a field distinct from robotics, and that somehow you need to position soft robotics relative to this. I think that soft robotics explores a new movement in robotics, but I believe it should be firmly remain rooted within the field of robotics. So I was just wondering how you view this distinction between these two fields.
Yeah, I do. That really resonates with me, what you're saying. I think there's a lot of value in having soft robotics be firmly rooted in robotics. And I think that the field kind of has to continue to mature so it actually gains this kind of more wide stream acceptance. And that's certainly something that my lab is pushing towards, and a lot of my former lab members are doing in their own research groups. So I agree with you on that. I just feel kind of for a lot of other researchers and efforts, I think sometimes soft robotics kind of sells itself short if it only kind of adheres to kind of robotics or putting it within that context of robotics. I think that there's cases in stretchable electronics and kind of more even the stuff Renee showed earlier today on kind of the soft medical type stuff that it's arguable kind of whether it kind of meets the formal definition of robotics, but I think that there's still a lot of value there, and I think it should still be pursued, and we shouldn't cut it off just because it doesn't meet the US National Science Foundation definition of robotics or whatever. So does that mean that there could be like this bifurcation? Potentially there could be like soft robotics, but then a more general thing of soft matter engineering or soft materials engineering. And I'm okay with that. But yes, I do feel that there should still be like soft robotics that are truly robotics. That should still be pursued. I'm not at all proposing that we kind of deviate from that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
On to the contributed paper extended abstract submissions that we have. I'm asking all the authors to please keep the time with your 5-minute presentations. because we have the option to discuss the posters outside for the people here in person, or all the extended abstracts are uploaded on the website, so you can access them there. So I would like to start with Cornel Dillinger. I think, yeah, you are here. Please share your screen and go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for having me in this very interesting workshop on soft robots gaining new abilities through smart and functional materials. In context of this workshop, I would like to show you my work on starfish-inspired ultrasound ciliary bands for microrobotic system that I have performed at ETH Zurich in the Acoustic Robotics and Systems Lab under the direction of my professor, Daniel Ahmed. I would like to start with where we got inspired from for this project. We found this very nice and interesting research article published by Professor Manu Prakash from Stanford University, which reveals that on the surface of an actual starfish larvae, two distinct ciliary band configurations are formed and are able, once set into oscillation, to induce two different flow fields. In a plus ciliary band configuration, the fluid field looks like a fluid source. If we have a minus ciliary band configuration, the fluid flow is reversed and looks like a fluid sink. Now, we were thinking, can we imitate this system using an ultrasound-driven system? And we started building polymeric ciliary bands, which you can see on the right. And once we actuated these systems using a kilohertz range ultrasound, we were able to very nicely mimic these two flow behaviors. Seeing this slide, I would like to highlight the novelty of these ciliary bands that we built. Normally, a biological cilia undergoes a whip-like non-reciprocal motion. This is needed to perform propulsion at the microscale in a low Reynolds number regime. However, our ciliary bands undergo just back and fro reciprocal oscillation, but in the kilohertz range, and therefore are able to produce propulsive forces on a microrobot, which I'll show you later, even though they undergo reciprocal oscillations. So for this workshop, I would like to highlight the materials that we used. We used a straightforward photopolymerization setup that we built on an inverted microscope. The photosensitive polymixture that forms the microrobots consists of 50% polyethylene glycol diacrylate with a molecular weight of 700 to 30% PEG with a molecular weight of 250. We add 5% of the photoinitiator and we add 15% of a buffer solution in order to make the cured material softer. These microscopic structures are then placed on a glass slide whereon we glue the piezoelectric transducer in order to stimulate and to actuate an acoustic wave in the acoustic chamber. Once the chamber is set into oscillation, this oscillation is transferred onto the ciliary band and we see this nice acoustic streaming pattern. Using this principle, we built a bio-inspired microrobot, its model organism is the starfish larvae. When we place such a fixed microrobot next to an actual starfish larvae, as you can see on this slide, you can see that we are very nicely able to mimic the flow behavior. Maybe pay attention here to the time resolution, whereas on the left, the video is speed up by 8 times. We had to slow down to have comparable streaming velocities by a factor of 20. Once such a robot is released, we were able to imitate translational motion of this bio-inspired microrobot that imitates the swimming behavior of the starfish larvae. But we were also able to imitate the trap and food transport mechanism of the starfish larvae. By placing a plus ciliary band just next to a minus ciliary band, we were able to imitate a trapping function and along the surface a transport mechanism, which the starfish larvae uses to trap plankton and guide this plankton towards its mouth. With this, I thank you for listening, and maybe I'd like to conclude by saying that in this project, not the soft material is really new, but I think the actuation of a soft material with ultrasound is quite new. Thanks for listening and enjoy the last day of the conference. Cheers.
Thank you very much for your presentation.